Welcome, I'm Darren, and I'll be your guide today as I look at the 1996 Sportflix set and also the 1995 Sportflix UC3 set. I'm going to do these in a kind of an awkward order because, well, I didn't really know how to include UC3 with the 1995 set because 95 went with 1994. This one was kind of like a standalone that felt almost like a tag on at the end of 1996. It wasn't, it was more of a bridge set. It was kind of a spin-off creating a different type of Sportflix set for reasons I certainly don't know. It's a very unusual set, but it just doesn't really fit with the lineage, so I figured I'd tack it on at the end after 1996. Although there is some continuity, there's a bit of a continuity error, continuity issue that comes along with that. So it's, I apologize for the order that it goes in, but this just, for me, this was kind of the way that I needed to approach it. And this brought Sportflix to a close. It's a shame that Sportflix had to come to a close because it was a really cool idea, and in the mid-1990s, they finally hit the rhythm. They figured out how to make the cards right, in part because of technology, and in part because the design ethos was now much better for the potential of what Sportflix lenticular card potential could be realized as. And the problem that they had with Sportflix was the fact that it was a card set that was a little bit too expensive for kids, but it was something that made more sense for kids. So even though the cards in the mid-1990s looked really good and were pretty much on par with some of the better cards of the year, or whatever year they were in, it was all about this fun little gimmick, which just doesn't really work well for collectors, especially when you want to put it on display. These cards don't really work for that. So they were more natural for kids, but they were not right for addressing the kid market in the correct way. So they were a card concept with no home. In the 1980s, they were a gimmick that didn't make sense as cards, and so they just never had anywhere to go. In the 1990s, they were a gimmick that was perfect for cards, except the market. There was no market that was perfect for it, and so while in football we only had 2 sets, in baseball we actually got 4 whole sets. So this was the grand hurrah, and you can see both the best and the, I'm not going to say the worst, but not quite the best, which was very much on display here as they were trying to figure this all out. But the one thing that is for sure about Sportflix was that in the mid-1990s was it took them a little bit, but once they got into it, inserts. They nailed inserts. In fact, that's where you really get to see the creativity. So for the 1996 Sportflix set, they created a card that was very similar to the 1995 card. It is a great shot in the front. Really crisp between the 2 images, very clean. Down at the bottom they have an expanding text for the player name, a very common thing in these cards. And that was about all that they needed to do, but the card came through beautifully the way that it was designed. Well, on the front, because on the back, I mean, you got to do something on the back, and Pinnacle was making so many cards by 1996 that it was difficult to come up with new things to do. And so for some of these sets, they just threw some weird, wild pop art thing on the back. And that's what they did with these Sportflix cards. But the fronts look fantastic. And one thing about Pinnacle at this point was they were doing artist-proof cards for all of their releases. And Sportflix was no different. So, in fact, all of the Sportflix cards from the mid-1990s, all the main set cards, with the exception of the first 1994 baseball set, all the other sets do have an artist-proof parallel. Here in 1996, this is the way that it looks. It's a disc and with gold foil and not subtle at all, which actually is very fitting. They also did rookies in this card set, which were not subtle in the least. I mean, these were cards where the concept for these cards was that the background was either a baseball or it was the grain of wood on a bat. And it was not a snap between the two like we saw with the photos. In this case, it was always a constant transition between the two. So it basically looks like a wood-grained baseball in most cases. It is a card that is not going to sneak up on you. This is about as strong and clear and bold as you're going to find a rookie card. But I really don't know why they didn't snap the image, why it was all with this big phase. But the other subset that they had in this set is a very impressive one, which is called UC3, which is a name we're going to get back to. Now, UC3 is a horizontal card, and the bottom band, it has a 3D effect of the UC3 text. Not too heavily 3D, but it still stands pretty strong. But it's the upper portion, which is very much a 3D effect, where it is a two-plane effect, so you have the space in between. And it's impressive just how much space they were able to get into these Sportflix cards, because Sportflix cards rarely had this type of depth that they were able to pull off. In the case of these UC3 cards, they were very well crafted and they worked out wonderfully. So quite impressive. And then to round out the set, they had a couple of checklists. Pinnacle liked to do checklist cards with player on the front, checklist on the back. This was no different, like they had done in 1995. Interestingly, all they list on the front is which league, AL or NL. They don't list who the player is, which, I mean, okay, I'm sure that when you're looking at this card, you might have a good idea of who the player is, but it is strange to make a card which showcases a player on the front with both images, by the way, but you don't even give his name on the card. Why they did it this way, I don't know, but this is the way they did their checklists. And that brings 1996 Sportflix to a close. But like I said, this was a release that was all about inserts. And or I should say that the inserts were where the strength was. And the first insert set was a carryover from 1995 called Double Take, which is just such an amazing card because it's a clear card in most cases, but not in all cases. Basically, there is a picture of a player and the background is gone, so it's just the see-through card. But this is Sportflix, so it flashes to a completely different player with a different pose. And the parts of the first player that are not matched to the second player disappear on the card. I mean, they are completely gone. And it is such a clear and clean presentation that it is eerie. Now you look on the back and you can see the two images, so you can see that they both exist. But on the front, it's so impressive to show off just how powerful Sportflix is, or lenticular cards can be, and that is very much on display with these cards. Then they have Hit Parade. And Hit Parade is impressive in a whole nother way because the background behind the player is the motion of a player swinging the bat. And the amount of range they have in this motion is really, really impressive. Because Sportflix was never really all that good in having a lot of film in the card. And here it's still pretty choppy. But the amount of path that the bat is able to go through on this card through the motion of it is very impressive. And this is a card where once you start to notice the motion, the player on the front disappears and it really doesn't matter who it is because that background is so clear and so strong. And then the third insert set is called Power Surge. And this follows along with the UC3 cards, the subset in the set, where horizontal, band down at the bottom, up at the top, they still have the 3D effect in it. But in this case, they have the background is partially see-through, so light shines through it, which makes the whole effect glow. It doesn't have the acuity of the cards in the set, so it doesn't have the true depth of space in it. But otherwise, it's still pretty effective. The glow is neat, but what's really unusual is that down at the bottom, they don't have light coming through, yet the Power Surge text can glow just as much as light passing through the top. So it's an interesting card. But the final insert set is another carryover from 1995 called Pro Motion. And Pro Motion is where you have a picture of a player that morphs into an object. In 95, it was a baseball mitt. In 1996, it's an array of bats, almost like a swing. And where in 1995, the morph looked like a weird sci-fi mess. In this case, the player just shrinks down into the bats, which gives a it makes the transition in the card look good and look interesting. So they fixed that up, but they really didn't change hardly anything else from 1995. So you got to pay attention to the difference between the two sets, because they're very similar in when you're at least looking at the player. And then they also did jumbo cards. These were box toppers that it's just a couple of players from the rookies in the set. So these are the same cards that have the baseball and the baseball bat flashing between them in the background. So these box toppers, again, just a couple of players, and these cards are enormous cards. These parallels for these cards. There's no difference between them other than just the enormous size. And they bring to a close the 1996 Sportflix set. And so that was the 1996 set. Now, like I said, in 1995, they had done a regular Sportflix set, but they also did an additional set called Sportflix UC3. And this name might sound familiar because that was actually a subset of the 1996 set, which we already looked at. So it can get a bit confusing, kind of like what Upper Deck did with UD, I think it was UD Ionics, that was both an insert set and, no, Holographics was both an insert set and a regular set. And there have been other cases as well. So UC3, there is a subset in 1996, but in 1995 there was a complete standalone set that didn't fit anything of the 1990s Sportflix legacy. The whole card, right from the outset, the design approach was so different. And in this case, they have a little cube that is the logo on the cards. They're done in, it's Sportflix, and so it's still using the lenticular card design. But in this case, they decided to go with the 3D effect on all these cards. And you might notice there's nothing subtle about this card. The 3D effect's not too bad, but that baseball completely overpowers the entire card, and it makes it look kitsch. I don't know if they were trying to go for more of a youthful audience or what they were going with, but where the Sportflix sets were all about the image, this was not. This was about the pastiche of design effect capability. Now, the baseball is for AL players. So for NL players, they have a baseball mitt, which means that this card set it jumps around all over the place. There's no continuity within the card set to really read cleanly. So it's an interesting experience to go through. And again, they have artist-proof cards, but for the artist-proof logo, this logo is actually a little bit different, because where in the Sportflix set, the logo was a gold circle around the AP letters. Here, it's a gold disc with black inserted into it, so it's a little bit different. But the thing about these logos, the reason that they're so bold, whether it's 95, 96, the reason it's so bold is to be able to compete with the chaotic nature of the motion and the different images, all the stuff going on in the card. They need that AP logo to be strong and clear, which these are. But that's the reason that it is such an obnoxious element on the cards. Now, the rookies for the UC3 set are, these look like inserts in the 95 set. I mean, these are very, very, very bold. And I'm not sure what else to say about it, because they really do look like an insert in 95. I don't know why they went with this, except for the fact that the UC3 set was just across the board. Everything was overpowering, with one exception, which was their in-depth subset. Now, the in-depth cards, this is the only true subset in the set, just like UC3 had been in Sportflix. Here in the UC3 set, it's in-depth. And these cards are a full bleed image that is almost completely unadorned. The idea here is to have more of that motion going on in the background to give a 3D effect. It doesn't really read too well on these cards, almost like they were rushed in a way. But there's no design feature on the card, which makes them, it makes it difficult to look at this card and associate it with the card set, almost like by the time they got to the end of the set, they were just completely out of backgrounds and they just said, all right, forget it, we're not even going to bother with it. It was a noble attempt to try to get that 3D effect going, but I think it's the verticality of the cards that limits the capability of these cards to work with the 3D effect. I think the horizontal orientation worked a lot better. And interestingly, for the inserts for UC3, they only have 3 inserts rather than 4. They're still quite impressive, and here you're able to see that they're playing around with them a lot more. Starting with the double take equivalent for UC3, which is Clear Shots. Now, Clear Shots uses the same idea of having a mostly see-through card. In this case, they have a portrait, and then they have an action shot of the same player. So every single one of these cards is a single player as opposed to the dual players that we'd seen in Double Take. Still very clear, very strong, very impressive. These do read wonderfully. And then for the second set, it's called Cyclone Squad. And Cyclone Squad is unique because here this is a card that almost doesn't even have the ridges that we're used to. It's very tight, very well crafted. It doesn't have the richness that we were seeing in basically all other lenticular cards from Sportflix. In this case, it looks almost like it's not there, and almost no motion goes on in the card. It's just the 2 discs rotate, but the amount of range that they rotate is very impressive, and there's a very clean quality to it that shows that these are very well crafted cards, although they're not very exciting cards, like not to any extent. And then they also did their Pro Motion cards, but in this case it's called 95 in Motion. In this case, instead of the player morphing into something, they have it so that it is a bunch of panels, and then the panels swing out toward you and rotate to become a full bleed image of the card. Rarely do you get it to where the full bleed image is perfectly clear. It's all about that effect, but kind of like with the baseball and wood grain of the rookies, most of the time this is somewhere in between, and it's kind of distracting. The effect was a noble enough concept, but they never got the clarity to make it read properly. So it doesn't quite get to where it otherwise could have been. Still, it's a cool card. And I mean, that's the way that all the inserts are. I'm not denigrating any of the inserts. The bar was really high for the inserts, and it was the UC3 set itself that I wasn't very impressed with. But that's just me. Overall, this was an interesting close to the Sportflix legacy. And I am kind of curious where they might have gone from here, because you could see that by 1996 they were still playing around and coming up with some cool stuff to do with these cards. And by 1997, just about everything that Pinnacle did looked great. So it could have been that Sportflix would even look better, or it could be that the direction that they went with UC3 was showing that they were reaching a little bit too far. Regardless, they never did get around to a 1997 set, so this did close it all out. And so that was the 1995 Sportflix UC3 set and the 1996 Sportflix set, although I did them in reverse. And yeah, so that brings it to a close. I have already done a video that looked at the 94 and the 95 set, and for that matter, I've done a video that looked at the Sportflix cards of the 1980s. If you haven't seen the videos, definitely check those out. Also, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, I do urge you to do so, and thank you very much for watching.